Here are 101 facts about Nissan and Infiniti. Nissan sold their first car under the name Dot in 1914, and 17 years later in 1931, they made another car which was a little smaller than the Dot, so they called it Dot Sun, as in son of Dot. But it was later pointed out to them that sun actually meant loss in Japanese, so they renamed it to Datsun with a U in 1932. If you've ever been to auto shows, you've probably gazed more at the models standing next to the cars than the cars themselves. Well, this idea of using models to not just sell cars but products in general all started with Nissan in 1936, where they hired 4 aesthetically inclined women to work in their showrooms, who then managed to increase sales by a good margin. Those women have since been known as the Miss Fairlady staff. Now let me ask you a question. Who is Nissan's biggest rival? Toyota, right? Actually, no. Nissan's biggest rival is Porsche, and it all started in the late 80s when Nissan was trying to develop the R32 GTR that was meant to dominate every car on the track. But since Nissan had never built a car like that before, they contacted Porsche and very politely offered to buy a 959 as a case study. But Porsche told them to take a hike like Nissan was some pizza boy. Pissed off and annoyed, Nissan hired a guy to buy the 959 on their behalf to be sent back to Japan, where they reverse engineered its all-wheel drive system and built their own version called the Atessa all-wheel drive system, which made the R32 one of the most successful racing cars in history. But that's not all. Nissan did the same exact thing for the R35, which didn't go on sale until Carlos Ghosn, Nissan's most controversial CEO, personally test drove the 911 Turbo and the R35 before launch to make sure it was actually better. Like 7% of my viewers, Nissan has long suffered from an identity crisis, which is why they've had 29 different logos since their conception. You know how turning off the stability control is a bit annoying in some cars? Well, wait until you hear this. To turn off the stability control in the 400Z, you have to crawl under the dashboard and compress the brake pedal, then you have to press the little button that appears under it. You'll also have to do this every single time you start your car. The 1988 240SX was the first Japanese car to have a heads-up display. Bet you didn't even know that it had one. This is the Infiniti Q30, and it's basically the auto industry's equivalent of Lana's baby. Because it was designed by Infiniti's American and European team, it was built in Britain with the Qashqai, and it mostly used Mercedes parts. Not to mention that it's a mix between a crossover, coupe, and SUV, while also being categorized as a hatchback and falling in the same class as the Megane. It's so ambiguous you can't even hate on it. No wonder it was discontinued. You know how some things only look good in one color? Well, the R34 is no exception, and that iconic color is called Bayside Blue, but it was initially supposed to be called Wangan Blue, which was inspired by Wangan-sen, a popular street racing route on the Shotoko Expressway. However, it was later changed because Nissan didn't want to be affiliated with the street racing group Midnight Club, and that was ultimately a smart decision, because Midnight Club was disbanded a year later in 1999, following a multi-car wreck that took someone's life. Most Nissans in racing have the number 23 because Ni means 2 in Japanese and San means 3. And yes, I intentionally didn't put this in number 23 just to piss you off. In 1989, Nissan decided to race against the Ford Cosworth in the Australian Touring Car Championship. So an Australian car magazine called Wheels wrote a cover story on the R32 GTR. But since everyone and their grandma was also going to write about it, Phil Scott, the magazine's editor, decided to choose a bright red R32 for the cover with the headline Skyline Supercar. But Phil didn't think it was unique enough to stand out, so he ran it by his colleague Angus Mackenzie, who suggested to use the word obakemono. So Phil immediately asked, "What's that?" Angus then explained that it was the Japanese word for monster. After hearing Angus's reply, Phil asked a very simple question. What, like Godzilla? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the R32 got the name Godzilla, which means that not only is the R32's legendary nickname Australian, it's also technically the only GTR that can be called Godzilla. In the 60s, Katsuji Kawamata, Nissan's president at the time, watched the Broadway musical My Fair Lady, and he loved it so much that he decided to name his new sports car after it, the Fair Lady Z, which worked perfectly in Japan. But Nissan's US counterpart thought the name was a bit confusing for a sports car, so they decided to sell it as the 240Z in America. We're all pronouncing Nissan very wrong, because the correct pronunciation is Nissan, and you die-hard fans should really know the difference, because Nissan means older brother in Japanese. Most of us have come to know the S13 for being a damn near perfect drift car, but interestingly, the S13 was never built for drifting. In fact, Nissan has publicly stated that it was specifically built and marketed towards educated single women, and those women made up over 75% of their buyers. The 270R S14 is the only S chassis to come with a Nismo badge, and it had upgraded suspension, brakes, gearbox, and body kit. Nismo also bumped its power output from 217 to 270 horsepower. Only 30 units were made, and they were all sold in Japan. In the 80s, Nissan established a company called Autech, which focused on customizing and building cool and quirky cars like the Stelvio AV1 and the 4-door R33 GTR that was used by Japan's highway patrol at some point. But my personal favorite is the S15 convertible, which was based on the S15 Spec S, and it was the first Japanese car with a fully electric convertible hardtop. This is the Nissan Micra, and it's a small, boring, yet somehow lovable urban cruiser. But most importantly, it has a rich history in racing. Nissan even made a sport version called the Super Turbo in 1988, which had a 0.9-liter four-cylinder that was both supercharged and turbocharged at the same time. That's how it got the name Super Turbo. And just to add on, the new Micra's tires were specially made by Bridgestone and were fine-tuned by the legendary F1 racer Stefano Modena. As most of you know, the Nissan Cube is a weird car with a lot of weird design cues. For example, it has a rippled headliner because the interior is meant to look like a jacuzzi. It also has a bulge on its rear door for absolutely no reason. But the weirdest thing about this car by far is the carpeting on its dashboard, which is also affectionately known as cube cubes. I say it's weird because you're not supposed to place anything on it. Then what the hell is it there for? The first generation X-Trail had a pop-up steering wheel, so you could change clothes in your seat. That's because Nissan hired young people to help with the X-Trail's development, and for some reason, they were all surfers. In 1984, Nissan decided to retire the name Datsun, so they changed their tagline from Datsun, we are driven, to the name is Nissan, bitch. Okay, I added that last part. But that small change ended up costing them around $500 million. It also took a year for it to go into effect across the US, which was really confusing, because in some states, the Datsun you bought last week was now a Nissan. If you look closely, you can see that the 370Z kind of looks like a shark, and that's because Shark Week came on the Discovery Channel while head designer Randy Rodriguez was working on the design of the car, so he decided to take inspiration from it. I wonder if John Saws was watching SpongeBob when he designed the cube, and I definitely don't want to know what he was watching when he added the cubes. In 1980, Nissan and Alfa Romeo got in bed to make the Alfa Romeo Arna, but instead of combining the best parts of the two companies like you would expect, they did the exact opposite by giving the design to Nissan and the production to Alfa Romeo, which is like getting a colonoscopy from your waiter and a sandwich from your gastroenterologist. If you don't know what that is, just ask 17.6% of my viewers. Nissan contracted Yamaha to build an engine for the Fairlady Z in 1961, and after a couple of months, Yamaha delivered a 2-liter dual overhead cam inline 6. But Nissan didn't like that engine because they thought it was too weak, so they told Yamaha to get lost. But since Yamaha had poured a lot of money into the development of that engine, they went next door and showed it to Toyota, who decided to use that same engine in the 2000 GT in 1967, which is one of the most iconic JDM legends of all time. In 1999, a man called Uzi Nissan received a phone call from Nissan, offering to buy his domain name Nissan.com. But he turned down that offer because he was already using it for his electronics business. But Nissan really wanted that domain, so they took him to court to try and seize it from him, not knowing that Uzi was a fighter who fought Nissan in court for 8 years straight, ultimately winning the lawsuit that cost him $3 million of his own money. He then used his rightfully owned website to share his story with Nissan, although that website has since been taken down because Uzi Nissan sadly passed away in the pandemic. His family has set up a GoFundMe page to help pay for his children's education. The link is down below if you'd like to contribute. For some reason, the ever-so-terrible Nissan Qashqai had 7,863 different variants you could choose from before picking the color. Nissan is so random. At the launch of the R35 in 2007, Nissan proudly claimed that the R35's ECU was completely unhackable and that no one could ever tamper with it. The R35's ECU was hacked within hours of it going on sale. Yikes! In the 80s, Japanese manufacturers kind of acted like up-and-coming rappers because they were flushed with cash following the fuel crisis, and they were hungry to prove themselves to the Italian and German titans by beating them at their own games. That's how we got the NSX. But as it turns out, Nissan made their own little Italian stallion before Honda. In 1985, Nissan made the MID4, which looked like a baby Testarossa, and 2 years later, they made the MID4 Mark II, which looked really similar to the NSX, and it used the twin-turbo VG30 from the Z32. Both of the prototypes handled great and met the design team's expectations, but Nissan sadly decided to walk away from both projects because they would cost way too much to build. Nissan decided to mark India's 68th Republic Day in January 2017 by creating the largest outline of a map on a dry lake bed in Rajasthan. Nissan sued India in December 2017 for $770 million. If you've ever owned a 350Z, you've probably noticed the 3 squares all over the car. Well, those squares mean something. We just don't know what. Nissan has never officially explained what they stand for, and we are all lost at this point. And if you don't believe me, Doug DeMuro called them the Z squares. And that's it. If he doesn't know what they're called, how the hell am I supposed to know? In 2018, Nissan CEO Carlos Ghosn was arrested in Tokyo for allegedly committing financial crimes. He was later released on a $9 million bail after his lawyers proved that he wasn't a flight risk. And what did Carlos do? Well, he squeezed himself into a crate, and he shipped himself to his hometown in Lebanon where he sought asylum. And he has since filed a $1 billion lawsuit against Nissan for the defamation of character. Let us know if you want to see a full video. The 300ZX was fully developed using CAD, which was pretty new back in the 80s. And funny enough, the Z32 is more aerodynamic than the brand new M4. Nissan actually made a rear-wheel drive test mule for the R32 GTR just to see how the car would handle. And as it turned out, it handled like a muscle car because the car wasn't able to put down any power, especially when the turbos kicked in. So they just scrapped it. But I imagine they had a lot of fun with it first. The R33, which many people consider to be the black sheep of the GTR family, was the first production car to post a sub-8-minute time on the Nürburgring. After production of the R34 Skyline ended, Nissan Motorsports, also known as Nismo, bought 20 of the best R34 GTR examples it could find, and proceeded to turn them into one of the most sought-after versions of the car, called the Nissan Nismo R34 GTR Z-Tune. And they were all painted in the same special Z-Tune silver, except for one. Z-Tune car number 10 was left in its original color, midnight purple, per the owner's request. Well, it was less of a request and more of an arm wrestle, because that owner argued with Nismo for over a year to keep the car's original color, and that same car is now worth over $1 million, all because Nismo couldn't handle some whining. That's probably why they rarely ever use CVTs. The R35 GTR was developed with Lotus, and its infotainment system was fully designed and integrated by the developers of Gran Turismo. Nissan and Renault joined forces to create the Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi alliance in 1999, which was for the most part a really good and trouble-free marriage. That's until in 2015, Carlos Ghosn tried to renegotiate the alliance to get control over Renault, which was partially owned by France. And that's when the French economy minister of the time, Emmanuel Macron, increased the French government's shares in Renault, basically shutting Carlos down and slapping him back to Japan. By the way, this incident caused a lot of tension between Japan and France for some time, like the two countries legit had beef. Nissan used to make rocket engines. Nissan's aerospace division was also responsible for getting Japan's first satellite into orbit. The Nissan Versa, aka the carrot top of the automotive industry, is the only car in the US to be sold with a 5-speed manual. In 1982, Nissan decided to put a voice warning system in the Datsun 810 Maxima, but making a talking car was a lot more challenging than you'd think, since it was in the pre-digital era. But that wasn't gonna stop Nissan. So after a lot of brainstorming, they decided to put tiny 3-inch vinyl records with pre-recorded messages under the dashboard. And to be honest with you, it kind of sounds like something from a low-budget horror movie.
Fuel level is low. Right door is open.
The first generation Nissan Versa has the same expression I had when I found out clouds weigh over 1 billion pounds, and that's mostly due to its oversized headlights. Well, those headlights are the way they are because they were designed to divert air from the side mirrors, thus reducing cabin noise and potential buyers. Nissan formed the GT Academy with Gran Turismo in 2008 to give gamers the chance of becoming professional race car drivers. And over the course of 8 years, 21 drivers graduated from the GT Academy, many of whom saw real success on the racetrack. In the 2010 Goodwood Festival, Nissan showed up with multiple GTRs and 370Zs wearing BMW, Audi, and Porsche logos next to fighter-style kill marks to show off their wins over these brands, and it caused quite a stir. But overall, Audi and BMW were pretty chill about the whole thing. Although the same can't be said about Porsche, who filed an official complaint with Goodwood officials and threatened to sue if Nissan didn't stop their campaign. Realizing that Germans aren't known for their sense of humor, Nissan removed the stickers and carried out like nothing ever happened. The 370Z was the first 6-speed manual car with rev matching. Now, as most of you know, you can't import Nissan GTRs before they reach 25 years old, with the exception of the limited edition models, because Nissan didn't want to submit them for crash testing in the US, but a company by the name of Motorex was able to illegally import them legally. I'll explain. In 1999, Motorex started buying GTRs from Japan and outfitting them with crash bars, airbag stickers, and anything else that was needed to pass the NHTSA's requirements. At first, business was good, but after some time, Motorex wasn't able to meet the demand, so they started lying to their customers and the Department of Transportation by selling cars which they claimed were legal, but actually weren't. And to make things worse, their founder, Hiro, was involved with some shady people due to his interest in hostess bars, which in turn got Motorex involved in many scandals, from car theft to kidnapping and even gun charges. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Hiro left the country and he hasn't been seen or heard from since. All in all, 34 R32s, 62 R33s, and 15 R34s were imported and registered, and it's still a gray area whether those cars are actually legal or not. You know how 50-50 weight distribution is considered the perfect ratio for fun and agile cars? Well, when it came to the 350Z, Nissan decided to intentionally give it 53-47 weight distribution, so under full throttle, the car would flatten to the golden ratio and have less understeer. The term Nissan came from the abbreviated form of Nihon Sangyo, which was used in the Tokyo Stock Exchange to refer to Nissan's predecessor company in 1933. The Nissan Juke's interior was designed to look like a motorcycle's interior, or exterior. I don't know, it's all very confusing. In World War II, a Japanese company by the name of Techikawa Aircrafts was established to build airplanes for the army. But after the war had ended, they switched to making cars and rebranded to Fuji Precision Industries, only to rebrand again in 1952 to Prince Motor Company. And guess what? They changed their name back to Fuji Precision Industries 2 years later, until 1961 when they went back to Prince. But why am I telling you this? Well, Prince was acquired by Nissan in 1966, giving them two very important things: Prince's popular line of cars called Skyline, and their racing division which ultimately became Nismo. The optional black roof on the 400Z is actually wrapped and not painted. Also, the chrome bit on the side is designed to resemble a katana. Nissan is a bit unconventional when it comes to their design process. For example, Nissan set up a competition between their American, European, and Japanese design teams to see who can make the better looking 350Z, and as some of you might know, the American team ended up winning. Nissan kind of did the same thing again for the R35, but this time instead of picking just one design, they ended up mixing two of them, and I think we can all agree that they absolutely nailed it. Nissan made self-parking office chairs. Again, they're very random. In the early 70s, Nissan released a series of ads for the Skyline GT, which featured an American couple by the name of Ken and Mari, because Nissan thought that American puppy love would sell. And you know what? They were right. In fact, the Ken and Mari series of ads were so popular that the Hakosuka GTR was dubbed the Kenamari Skyline. The 1984 Nissan Laurel was the first car in the world to have retractable power mirrors. This is the Infiniti G35, which is a more refined version of the 350Z, aka it's a more bougie drift car. It was also at some point a less supercar, because the R35 was developed using a G35 test mule. Nissan had their own emissions scandal in Japan, but unlike VW, Nissan's emissions data weren't falsified because of greed or money. They were falsified out of sheer stupidity, because they didn't know how to properly calibrate their test equipment, which is why the government just let them off with a warning. In the 80s, Nissan decided to open a new division to focus on building quirky retro cars, at a time when retro designs weren't cool. That division ended up making 4 very cool pocket-sized cars that were known as Pike cars, because they were built at their Pike factory. I think these cars are the only ones in history that would push a man to treat it like a baby. I mean, look at this, I could honestly eat it up, oh yes I could. The Nissan Leaf has a solar panel on its spoiler, which is as impactful as the Heart Part 6. The Patrol holds the world record for the largest synchronized car dance in history, where 180 patrols drove around in the shape of a falcon in Dubai. The Patrol also holds the world record title for being the fastest car to climb a 100-meter sand dune in Jordan, and it was able to do it in just 4.9 seconds. This is Alfonso Albaiza, and he's Senior Vice President of Nissan's Global Designs. He's also originally from Cuba, so when the US embargo on Cuba was finally lifted in 2014, Alfonso decided to go there with his Infiniti Q60, making it the first American car to arrive in Cuba in 58 years. One of the quirkiest Pike cars we just talked about is the Nissan S-Cargo, and Nissan got that name from the French word escargot that translates to snail, which is exactly what the S-Cargo looks like. I love how self-aware they are. And yes, I'm looking at the 7% of you. Now here's a question for you. What do you do when your SUV isn't that strong in the sales department? Do you A, make it faster, B, more luxurious, or C, cheaper? Well, when Nissan was faced with this exact dilemma, they chose Z and decided to make a cross cabriolet version of the Murano, which can only be described in one way.
What's that?
Last year, Nissan made 2 ads for the hybrid Qashqai, one of which included the Flash, hoping to get publicity for their new car, which they definitely did when both of those ads were banned, because the advertising authority claimed Nissan misled people into believing the hybrid Qashqai didn't need any petrol, and Nissan has since changed their vague tagline of a unique electrified experience to an even more vague tagline of the pleasure of electric without the need to plug in. This is not a 2018 Nissan Versa, because a Versa is like a Bentley compared to this. This is actually a 2024 Nissan Sunny, which is very popular in the Middle East thanks to its simplicity and reliability. In fact, it's so simple that it still has manual crank windows. And that's not all. It doesn't have a temp gauge or a seatbelt warning chime. And by the way, I'm talking about the top trim model here. It does have Bluetooth though. The 1959 Datsun S211 was the first Japanese sports car-ish, because it was built on the chassis of a compact pickup truck, and it had a tiny 1-liter 4-cylinder making 36 horsepower. The R35 holds the title for the fastest drift ever recorded, which was achieved by Masato Kawabata in 2016, when he drifted his 1400 horsepower GTR at 189 miles per hour in the Fujairah International Airport in Japan. Nissan has always been really smart when it comes to advertising their cars. For example, they would place their cars in musicals and theaters for product placement as far back as 1930. They also only made their ads in color when color TVs first arrived, to stand out from the competition. But their smartest ad campaign was in 1966, when they unveiled their new car and asked the public to choose its name for them. And after receiving 8.4 million letters, the public ended up choosing the name Sunny. The most brilliant part about this campaign wasn't the free publicity. It was the fact that it made 9% of the Japanese population study the spec sheet of a car, which they were involuntarily forming an emotional bond to by naming it. In 1951, the Japanese government put out an open contract for a military vehicle, with the only stipulation being that it couldn't look anything like the Willys Jeep. Toyota and Nissan participated, but Toyota ended up getting the contract, so Nissan decided to take their car to market to make back some of the money they spent on developing it, and that's how we got the Patrol. Nissan's electric cars have a 4-wheel control system called e-Force, which among many things reduces motion sickness in passengers and pets, making the Nissan Ariya one of the most pet-friendly cars out there. Nissan made a how to open your trunk tutorial for the 2016 Maxima, when they should have done a how to turn up the radio so you wouldn't hear your CVT whine tutorial. Pretty much all brands make smaller, more affordable versions of their flagship sedans. For example, the 3 Series is the cheaper, more compact version of the 5 Series, and so is the Corolla for the Camry. But for some reason, Nissan's flagship sedan, aka the Maxima, is smaller than the Altima by 0.1 inches. We'd all like to believe that size doesn't matter, but unlike Kendrick and Drake, it really does. Every Nismo engine, including the one in the R35, is hand-built by one of 4 people called Takumi. Nissan zero-gravity seats target 14 different pressure points in your body to help you sit in the optimum seating position. Nissan chose the name Zero Gravity because their goal was to create the natural seating position you would have if you were to float in space. What is the most basic thing a car should have? A name, right? Well, this thing doesn't have that. Seriously, it doesn't have a single badge anywhere except for the Nissan logo. And before you say it's probably a modern D21, it's not. We looked everywhere. Up until 2016, this truck was sold in the Middle East and some parts of Asia as the Pickup, which is a description, not a name. Please let us know in the comments if you know what it's called. In 2023, Nissan teamed up with Sony to make the movie Gran Turismo, which was based on a true story about Jan Mardenborough's incredible journey of going from a gamer to a full-on professional driver thanks to Nissan's GT Academy. Which all sounds good. That's until you start checking the facts, and you realize that this movie is as factual as Winnie the Pooh, because Sony changed a lot of things. For example, he wasn't the first winner of the GT Academy. He finished 3rd in his first race, not 27th. His infamous crash happened 4 years after when the movie claimed, and he didn't actually break the lap record in the 24 hours of Le Mans. With all that said, I'd still recommend you watch it because it's pretty good. The 350Z will automatically turn off the AC compressor under full throttle to give you everything it's got. In 1990, Nissan made the Pulsar GTI-R to compete in the World Rally Championship, and this little hatchback has gained notoriety for being Godzilla's little brother, because it came equipped with an SR20 that made 230 horsepower, paired with the GTR's Atessa all-wheel drive system. But most importantly, it had an umbrella tucked away inside its doorframe, because Nissan didn't want their race car drivers to stand in the rain and get all wet. Just like Audi, Nissan has a professional sniffer called Ryunosuke Ino, who's responsible for their cars smelling just right. That's until some college guy buys it and it starts smelling like weed and wet socks. In 2011, a video started circulating around of a Frontier saving a plane with malfunctioning landing gear by very heroically going under it and offering to be its tires. People were amazed by this video, and they shared it everywhere, driving up the Frontier sales. But that plane was actually CGI. A very well made one, but still, I'm telling you, if Nissan's cars were better built, they would have overtaken Toyota with their impressive advertising skills. The 2007 Infiniti EX35 was the first car in the world to have a 360 camera. Shell made a 370Z out of acrylic glass in 2010 to show people how oil flowed through an engine. By the way, no CGI was involved this time. It actually had functioning pistons, crankshaft, and valve train. Nissan had a 4-wheel steering system called Highcast from 1985 to 2010, which means that the R32, R33, R34, Z32, S13, S15, G35, and G37 all had 4-wheel steering. Nissan gave birth to Infiniti in 1989, but they're currently sold as Nissan Skylines in Japan. They even have Nismo versions over there. Let me ask you this, what comes to mind when you sit in a Leaf? If for some bizarre reason you said plastic water bottles, you are completely correct, because over 60% of the Leaf's interior is made of recycled water bottles, which will then be recycled again to make more Leafs. It's just a vicious yet somehow extremely boring cycle. The R32 GTR was the undefeated champion in the Japanese Grand Touring Championship from 1990 to 1993. And if that's not impressive enough, the R32 won every single race in those 4 years. That's 29 races in a row. Nissan will be discontinuing the Versa, Altima, Maxima, and the GTR in 2026 to make way for their new electric lineup, which they might make in partnership with Honda. In 2015, Nissan made the GTR LM Nismo, which was the first front-wheel drive car in Le Mans. Now, I'd like to tell you that it was revolutionary and it changed the game, but it really didn't. It was actually terrible, because the car couldn't put any power down even though Nissan fit bigger tires on the front. And to make things worse, it was unreliable and down on power most of the time, because the car was underdeveloped. It's safe to say that Nissan won't be trying this again. In the early 90s, the Nissan Patrol was rebadged and sold in Australia as the Ford Maverick. This also makes it the most reliable Ford in the world. In 2013, a guy by the name of Luke Aker decided to make a full-on professional ad to sell his used 1996 Maxima GLE Sport, which was really good. So good that Nissan decided to buy the car from Luke and fully restore it for it to be put on display at their North American headquarters. The Nissan Xterra had a storage compartment on its roof from factory. It also had pen holders under its center console. If you pull the windshield wiper stalk twice on any Nissan, it will go into vertical service mode. Nissan made a supercar called the R390 GT1 in 1998, and it was genuinely a supercar. It had a twin-turbocharged 3.5-liter V6 making 550 horsepower, which was mated to a 6-speed sequential gearbox, and the car barely weighed over a ton, giving it a 0 to 60 time of 3.9 seconds, and a top speed of over 200 miles per hour. Nissan made only one road-legal version of this car, because it was all they needed to enter the GT racing class. Side note, people claim that Nissan secretly made a red short-tailed version which was sold to a private buyer, but that's not true. The red car was actually repainted blue and re-VINed after Nissan decided to make the tail longer to improve stability. For once, we get the long stick with Japanese cars, because the S14 was discontinued in Japan in 1996, but America got it for 2 more years until 1998. I mean, sure, we didn't get the cool engine, but hey, beggars can't be choosers. The Lamborghini Diablo used the 300ZX's headlights, so did the R390 GT1. The C33 L'Oreal might be the most underrated Nissan of all time, because it had the same RB25 as the R32 Skyline GTS and the same suspension as the S13, kind of making it the perfect drift car. The R35 was so fast that it dislocated Jeremy Clarkson's neck at the Fuji Speedway, but that didn't stop Jeremy from becoming the sexiest man in Britain, mostly because he's allergic to manual labor. While Nissan was working on the original Z, they wanted to make the car as cheap as possible to rival other brands, especially in the US, because they knew it would be hard to sell a car that no one has ever heard of, but it would be much easier to sell a cheap car. And after crunching the numbers, Nissan decided to build the 240Z with interchangeable parts, meaning they only had to make a couple of Z-specific parts, because it shared its platform with other Nissans, and that philosophy has been the reason behind Nissan's success ever since. Nissan used to make 3-wheeled cars in the early 1900s. If you've seen the movie Into the Wild, you're probably familiar with the story of Alexander Supertramp and his beloved Datsun. But in case you haven't, Alexander was a famous American adventurer who decided to drive his Datsun from Virginia to Alaska when he came across a flash flood in California that completely flooded his engine. But since he didn't have a valid license, insurance, or registration, he couldn't call for help in fear of getting arrested. So he took his plates alongside his personal belongings and ditched the car. But that wasn't the end for the little Datsun, because since it became public property without an owner, the DEA was able to fix it and use it in an undercover drug operation. And that's all we know about the car, because no one knows where it is or what happened to it. The RB30 is becoming more and more popular among tuners because they're cheap and can make relatively good power. But many don't know that the RB30 was never built in Japan. Instead, it was built in South Africa and Australia. It could also be found in the R31 Skyline and, surprisingly, the Y60 Patrol. Nissan's used EV batteries power some of Japan's train crossings to cut down on waste. Nissan still makes the Y61 Patrol in the Middle East, which was introduced in 1998, but now it's called the Super Safari and costs around $45,000. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you want to see more.